Something invisible waits in the wilderness, moving silently through snow, brush, and shadows, striking with sudden, unstoppable force when hunters least expect it. In this video, you'll hear 6 terrifying encounters, from a massive Kodiak bear tearing through a campsite to a rutting bull moose charging ATVs in northern Maine. These stories show how hunters fared against ferocious predators, massive moose, and the raw, unpredictable power of nature. October 12, 2021 was settling over the remote larch forests of Russia's Amur Oblast, the sky bruised with fading light and the first frost coating the uneven ground in a thin, glimmering sheet of ice. 5 hunters, rugged men who had spent decades in these wildernesses, had returned from a long day tracking a red deer, their faces streaked with sweat and cold. Among them was Mikhail Ivanov, the eldest at 52, a veteran of countless hunting seasons, and his son Yura, a stocky 30-year-old with a reputation for precision with a .308 Winchester. The youngest of the group, 12-year-old Alexei, had accompanied them reluctantly, fascinated by the wilderness, yet aware he would mostly carry packs and observe. The other 2, Sergei and Nikolai, were in their 30s, seasoned trackers who had grown up in the forests surrounding the Amur, their steps light and confident despite the deep snowdrifts that crunched beneath them. The men had cornered a massive red deer earlier that day, finally bringing it down after a tense chase that left their boots soaked in frozen blood. And now they were preparing to skin the animal near their small canvas camp. The air was sharp and still, carrying the metallic tang of the deer's blood through the trees, drifting over frost and larch needles. As Mikhail knelt to make the first incision, Yura carefully held the animal steady, blade glinting dimly as the last rays of sun disappeared behind the horizon. Alexei hovered nearby, shivering in the cold, eyes wide as he watched his elders work with the methodical efficiency of hunters who had done this hundreds of times. Sergei and Nikolai were arranging the gear, checking ammunition and axes, unaware of the shadows stirring beyond the thin line of campfire light, where the larch trees grew thick and dark. Without any warning, a monstrous shape erupted from the forest, the snow beneath its feet exploding outward as it charged in absolute silence until impact. The Russian grizzly, 1,500 pounds of muscle and fury, easily hit Mikhail with a devastating force that folded him backward, snapping his spine like dry wood beneath a hammer. The air seemed to shatter with the sound of the impact, a crushing, bone-breaking force that left the men stunned and frozen for a fraction of a second too long. The bear did not hesitate, did not bluff or test. Its jaws gaped, claws ripping into canvas and flesh alike, the smell of its musk mingling with the coppery tang of blood. Yura raised his rifle in a heartbeat, firing a precise .308 round into the bear's chest, the recoil jolting him backward as the animal roared, a deep, deep, terrifying bellow that vibrated through the ground and rattled the remaining hunter's bones. Sergei and Nikolai unleashed their 7.62 x 5.4R rifles, bullets thudding into the massive hide with resounding cracks. Yet the bear surged forward, seemingly unaffected, its momentum a terrifying blend of raw power and predatory focus. Snow sprayed in every direction as it swung, massive forearms, claws slashing through pack, canvas, and limbs with indiscriminate violence. Alexei froze, the sound of bones snapping and the guttural roars echoing through the trees, his stomach twisting as the bear descended on his family and mentors. One of the men, realizing the child's peril, shoved him backward and shouted over the chaos, urging him to run, to vanish into the darkening forest. Terrified but obedient, Alexei bolted, his boots slipping on icy snow as he plunged into the dense larch, branches scratching his arms and face. Behind him, the bear tore through the hunters with merciless efficiency. Each movement a blend of instinct, fury, and raw strength that left rifles bent and ammunition spent. The ground churned with snow and crimson. The two remaining hunters attempted to flank the bear, hoping to draw its attention away from Alexei, maneuvering in wide arcs while firing sporadically, each shot more desperate than the last. The bear pivoted with impossible speed for its size, swiping one hunter into a heap of snow and blood, while the other barely avoided its swinging claws, rolling and scrambling to his knees. Every breath came in ragged gasps. Every muscle screamed in terror and exertion. Yet the bear's focus was unrelenting, a predator that had smelled vulnerability and would not relent. Minutes stretched like hours, each second marked by a shower of snow and splintered gear. The air filled with the roar of the bear, the thud of rifles, and the panicked shouts of men fighting for their lives. The forest seemed to close in, the larches bending under the sudden wind stirred by the animal's mass, the sun completely gone, leaving only twilight and the flicker of dying campfire embers. The hunter's strength faltered, shots misfired, and one by one, the bear struck with terrifying precision, leaving bodies sprawled in unnatural angles, rifles empty and splintered, blood mixing with snow in patterns too chaotic to comprehend. Hours later, the forest had gone silent, save for the occasional whisper of wind through the trees and the distant cry of a raven drawn to carrion. Alexei emerged cautiously from the shadows of the larch, shaking violently, limbs trembling as he followed faint tracks toward the nearest ranger outpost. His clothes were torn, hands cut and bleeding, face streaked with frozen tears, but he was alive, silent and hollow-eyed from what he had witnessed. The rangers, alarmed by his sudden appearance in the night, led him back to the scene where the full horror was revealed. 5 rifles, shattered and empty, lay scattered among the snow. The ground churned crimson around the fallen hunters whose faces and bodies had been twisted in the final moments of struggle. Investigation later confirmed what Alexei had seen, but could hardly comprehend at 12 years old. The bear had been drawn by the scent of blood, likely tracking the hunters for hours without detection, a silent shadow waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Nothing in the forest, no tracks beyond its own, hinted at premeditation. It had acted as instinct demanded, a colossal predator operating under the simple, terrifying logic of survival and opportunity. Alexei returned to the Amur villages later that week, his body intact but his mind forever haunted. A child who had seen the limits of human endurance and the sheer, unbridled force of a creature built to dominate its environment. October 18, 2019, had arrived in Alaska's interior, bringing a calm that belied the danger lurking in the frozen expanse. The horizon was a seamless sheet of white and gray as the first light struggled to penetrate the endless snowfields. Marcus Hayes, a seasoned hunter in his 40s with years of Alaskan backcountry experience etched into his lean, weathered face, trudged through waist-deep snow alongside his partner, Elena. Equally experienced, her dark hair tucked under a fur-lined hood, eyes sharp and alert despite exhaustion. They had been tracking a herd of caribou for several days, navigating frozen rivers and dense stands of spruce and birch, careful to leave no trace of their passage, rifles slung and ammunition close at hand. Their packs were heavy with supplies, but the cold had already begun to sap their strength, each step requiring a careful calculation of balance over treacherous ice hidden beneath the freshly fallen snow. By late afternoon, clouds had thickened, transforming the landscape into a disorienting blur where snow and sky merged, erasing all trails and landmarks. Their GPS faltered under the storm's intensity, flickering once before darkening entirely, leaving them blind in the immense, featureless wilderness. The wind had risen, slicing across the tundra with a howl that carried through the skeletal forest, rattling branches and whipping loose snow into freezing sprays that stung exposed skin. Marcus and Elena pressed on, muscles burning, lungs gasping, aware that one misstep could mean a fall onto hidden ice or into a snowdrift deep enough to immobilize them in the sub-zero cold. By nightfall, the temperature had plunged past negative 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and the blizzard had become a living force, battering them from all sides, obscuring sight to mere feet and muffling sound in a thick, white fog. Visibility vanished, and every direction looked identical, a frozen void that seemed to swallow the world. Exhaustion drove them forward until, almost by luck, they stumbled across a partially buried log cabin, its roof sagging under a thick layer of snow and ice. Forced into survival mode, Marcus pried open a window, and together they clambered inside, shivering violently, bodies stiff from cold and limbs raw from constant exertion. Inside, the cabin was dark and unwelcoming, filled with the smell of damp wood and rot, but it offered the promise of shelter. Marcus quickly set to work lighting a fire, the flickering flames doing little to thaw the chill seeping into their bones. Elena arranged their meager supplies, rationing dried meat and a small bag of flour, knowing they might be trapped for days. Outside, however, the wilderness had not forgotten them. The scent of human flesh and warmth drew attention, and the distant howls of wolves began, initially low and tentative, then rising in volume and intensity, echoing across the snowy expanse. Marcus and Elena watched from frost-covered windows as the storm seemed to coalesce with the predators, the pack circling the cabin, paws pounding against hidden ice and snow, jaws snapping at walls, testing the strength of their temporary sanctuary. The hunters knew that the wolves were intelligent, patient, and capable of waiting until exhaustion or error left them vulnerable. Marcus fired his .30-06 into the swirling snow, a warning shot that scattered some of the pack. Still, others lingered, weaving through drifts, howling in coordinated calls, seemingly unafraid of the human presence and determined to assert dominance over the territory. For the next 48 hours, Marcus and Elena endured the blizzard and the wolves' relentless stalking, each hour a test of endurance and mental fortitude. They rationed their supplies carefully, gnawed on dried meat and cold biscuits to maintain energy, and kept the fire alive despite the cold trying to snuff it out at every gust. Every creak of the cabin, every snow-laden branch scraping against walls sent shivers down their spines, and the howls of the wolves became a constant, rhythmic drumbeat of menace, reminding them that the wilderness was still in control, that even experienced hunters were vulnerable when stripped of mobility and the terrain's advantages. The fire's glow flickered over frost-laden windows as Marcus and Elena huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat and silent resolve, aware that even the slightest lapse in attention could be fatal. Sleep came in short, exhausted bursts, always punctuated by the wolves circling and the blizzard's unrelenting roar, each waking moment a mixture of fear and calculation, a negotiation with a world that demanded respect and patience. Their hands were cracked and bleeding from exposure, their faces swollen and raw from the wind's relentless assault. Yet they remained vigilant, rifles at the ready, every nerve attuned to the sounds of the storm and the pack. On the second evening, as the storm began to lessen, a cautious silence fell over the forest, the wind abating enough to reveal faint outlines of the pack's retreating forms, shadows slipping between snow-laden trees. Marcus stepped outside first, boots crunching on hard-packed snow, scanning the horizon, while Elena followed, both of them bruised, frostbitten, and trembling from the ordeal. They emerged from the blizzard and the forest, shaken but alive, the weight of the wilderness's lesson heavy on their shoulders. The wolves had retreated, yet Marcus and Elena knew they had been lucky, that the storm and the pack had tested every skill and instinct they possessed, revealing vulnerabilities that experience alone could not erase. Every step back toward civilization was measured, careful as they assessed ice beneath snow and the lingering scent of predators that clung to the cold air. When they finally reached a ranger station 3 miles beyond the tree line, they were bruised, exhausted, and forever marked by the experience. Their faces were pale from frostbite, and their eyes reflected the haunting memory of 2 days spent trapped between a blizzard and a pack of wolves that had known exactly how to exploit their isolation. The wilderness had spared their lives, but the encounter would linger indefinitely. November 7th, 2020, descended over Idaho's Salmon Chalice National Forest with a crisp chill that hinted at the approaching winter. The sun, a fading orange smear against the horizon, as 2 hunters navigated a ridge blanketed in fresh snow. Jacob Turner, a seasoned elk hunter in his late 30s with a rugged frame and calloused hands, led the way, eyes scanning the terrain for signs of movement, while his companion Marcus Bell, slightly younger but equally experienced, followed with a rifle slung across his back, fingers numb inside thick gloves. Both men were familiar with the forest, having tracked elk across these ridges for years. Yet the snow's soft layer over familiar paths added an unsettling quiet, muting the usual forest sounds and making each snap of a twig or distant bird call sharper and more alarming. The day had begun with promise. Fresh tracks of a bull elk whining between clusters of fir and larch, the animal's prints deep in the snow. Jacob and Marcus had followed them cautiously, boots sinking into powder with each step, rifles ready, eyes scanning ridgelines and hollows. As the afternoon wore on, the hunters began to notice anomalies. Tracks that were too large and round to belong to elk, pads showing claws and a fluid feline stride. A mountain lion, the size of which would later be estimated at more than 100 pounds of muscle, had been trailing them, keeping a careful distance, covering their scent while assessing their movements. The realization struck both men simultaneously, a sudden spike of adrenaline that stiffened muscles and sharpened reflexes. Determined not to abandon the hunt entirely, they pressed on, weaving around snow-laden boulders and frozen brush, rifles up, fingers brushing triggers, hearts pounding in synchrony with the muted thumps of their boots in the cold snow. Each pause to observe the elk became a tense negotiation between predator and prey, with the unseen mountain lion occupying a shadowed role, patient and calculating. The sky dimmed quickly, the day's last light fading to a cold blue twilight, turning the forest into a maze of silhouettes and shadows that could conceal deadly movement. Near dusk, as Jacob navigated a narrow ridge overlooking a frozen creek, the mountain lion made its strike. A massive shape exploded from a boulder, leaping with a terrifying grace and speed onto Jacob's back. The impact sent him crashing face first into the snow, the cold instantly biting through his jacket and his rifle spinning several feet away, leaving him momentarily defenseless. Snow flew in a chaotic spray, catching in hair and eyelashes, mixing with the sharp metallic tang of fear as Jacob struggled beneath the immense weight and claws of the animal. Pain flared in his shoulders and chest, every movement punctuated by the rasping sound of claws scraping against fabric and flesh. Marcus reacted instinctively, firing a single round into the dimming landscape, the shot ringing across the ridge. The flash briefly illuminated the dark shape, but the bullet missed, passing just above the lion's back, which twisted with cat-like agility, keeping Jacob pinned with impossible strength. Marcus dropped to the ground, barreling forward through snow and ice, lifting his rifle not for another shot, but to strike with the butt. The impact connected, forcing the cat to release its grip with a hiss and a sudden twist. Yet before it disappeared, its claws slashed down Jacob's left arm, leaving a deep, burning gash that bled into the snow and seared like fire through his veins. The mountain lion vanished into the trees without a sound, leaving only the echoes of movement and the sudden, oppressive silence of the forest. Jacob's chest heaved, shoulders trembling as he pushed himself upright, and Marcus helped him regain balance, scanning every shadowed hollow for a return strike, fingers gripping the rifle as though it could anchor them to reality. They assessed the wound, deep but not fatal, the blood stark against the white snow, the adrenaline still coursing through every nerve, heightening awareness and fear. Each man knew instinctively that the forest was not done with them, that the predator's patience had been extraordinary, waiting hours for the perfect moment to strike and then vanishing as if it had never been there. Too shaken to continue the descent in darkness, the hunters abandoned the ridge and made camp at the first sheltered spot they could find, a shallow depression between boulders that offered partial protection from the cold wind. They built a small fire with trembling hands, carefully rationing the remainder of their supplies, the flames barely cutting through the creeping cold that had begun to gnaw at extremities. Every crackle of wood sounded like distant movement, every shadow beyond the firelight a possible return of the predator, and sleep was impossible, the hours stretching into a tense vigil that tested both resolve and courage. Throughout the night, the mountain lion's presence lingered like a phantom, traces revealed in the snow around their camp, large paw prints slightly filled with fresh powder, circling and retreating as if confirming that its reconnaissance had not ended. Jacob traced the prints with a gloved hand, noting their proximity to the camp and the careful distance maintained. The intelligence behind the stalking was evident in every detail. It had not been a mindless attack, but a patient, calculating test of vulnerability, waiting until twilight offered the perfect opportunity, and the hunter's focus was divided by fatigue and terrain. By the next morning, the storm of fear had not entirely lifted, but the forest seemed to exhale with the rising sun, casting long shadows over the snow and illuminating the ridge with muted light. Jacob and Marcus, bruised and cold, packed their minimal supplies, tending to Jacob's arm and rechecking rifles, making every movement deliberate, aware that a single misstep could renew danger. The mountain lion had disappeared into the vast expanse of forest, yet its lessons lingered, a reminder of the deadly balance between hunter and hunted, the subtle intelligence of a predator that could move unseen for hours, and the humility required to survive in such a place. As they descended the ridge toward the nearest trail, snow melting beneath weak morning sun, both hunters carried a mixture of relief and reverence, hearts still hammering from the encounter. It was August 14th, 2022, and a pale moon rose above the dense spruce and alder that lined a riverbank in Kodiak Island, casting elongated shadows across the rushing water and jagged rocks. David Carlisle, a veteran hunter in his late 40s with broad shoulders and weathered hands, adjusted the straps of his pack and surveyed the small clearing they had claimed for their campsite. the scent of fresh fish, and the day's moose hunt still lingering in the air. Beside him, Sofia Ramirez, mid-30s, wiry and precise, checked her rifle, the polished stock catching the moonlight as she ensured rounds were loaded and safety off. Young Eric, barely 14, had been allowed to accompany them for the first time on such a remote hunt, his excitement tempered by fatigue from the day's trek through dense brush and over ice-laced river rocks. The three had spent hours tracking a large bull moose along the river, moving quietly through the humid August night, setting up camp once darkness swallowed the forest, and beginning to prepare a small meal to celebrate the day's success. The fire crackled faintly, flames dancing over the riverbank and reflecting off scattered pans and overturned logs, filling the campsite with warmth and light against the creeping chill of the night. David and Sophia had organized their tents near the river's edge, positioning cooking gear and supplies in a small, cleared area, taking care to minimize the scent trails leading into the trees, though they knew full well that in Kodiak, even the faintest aroma could attract a predator of considerable size. The air was heavy with the smell of cooked fish and smoked meat, a tempting combination for any large animal with a keen sense of smell, and the forest around them seemed deceptively quiet. The usual chorus of nighttime insects and distant calls had been replaced by a tense hush. Just past midnight, the silence was shattered. From the dense brush along the river's edge, a massive Kodiak bear exploded into the clearing, driven by scent and instinct, muscles rippling beneath brown fur streaked with silver. It crashed through alder and spruce with shocking speed, snow and debris flying as it zeroed in on the source of the smell. The storage bin containing their remaining food erupted under the bear's immense claws, snapping lids and scattering contents across the trampled ground. David reacted instantly, raising his .375 H&H Magnum, firing into the massive shoulder of the bear. The recoil nearly knocked him off balance, but the bear barely faltered, shaking off the impact like a living avalanche of muscle and fury, its focus unwavering as it swiped tents into tangles of fabric and poles. Chaos erupted in the campsite. Tents collapsed under the bear's weight, sleeping bags and backpacks crushed beneath enormous paws, and cooking gear flew in every direction. Sophia lunged for Eric, pulling him back just as the bear swung, claws tearing through the edge of a tent that had once offered fragile shelter. The roar of the Kodiak bear filled the night, a deep, resonant bellow that vibrated through the ground and sent shock waves into the hunter's chest, forcing every heartbeat into frantic, shallow gasps. Sparks flew as David fired again, bullets thudding into thick fur, yet the bear pivoted with astonishing speed, knocking over a cast-iron skillet and sending the fire sputtering as flames leapt into wet grass and debris. Eric, shaking uncontrollably, huddled behind Sophia as David braced himself, planting his boots into the churned riverbank and firing a third shot. The bear staggered slightly, shoulder recoiling from the repeated impact, yet it remained dangerously mobile, pivoting on powerful hind legs to swipe its scattered gear and the last intact tent, its eyes wild with predatory intensity. Every second stretched unbearably, punctuated by the bear's roars, the thud of flying logs, and the snap of broken poles, the forest around them alive with the violence of the encounter. Sophia remained calm despite the terror, her arms locked around Eric as she backed toward the river, knowing that proximity to water might discourage the bear from pressing its attack further. David maneuvered around the mess of gear and snow, each step a careful calculation as he aimed and fired again, bullets sinking into fur and muscle, leaving small sprays of blood that seemed to provoke rather than deter the colossal predator. The bear swiped at him, pawing and raking, and David stumbled, landing against a boulder, the impact sending shockwaves of pain through his ribs. Minutes felt like hours as the standoff continued, the bear's focus unbroken, a terrifying blend of instinct, curiosity, and territorial aggression driving it to dominate the small clearing. David's repeated shots began to take a toll. The bear's movements slowed fractionally, powerful shoulders heaving as it assessed the threat from the humans still standing. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, it pivoted, head turning toward the darker forest, and with a last snarl, it vanished into the trees, leaving the riverbank littered with the remnants of what had been a well-ordered campsite. Broken tents sagged, poles snapped, cooking gear scattered and crushed, and the snow was marked with deep claw impressions and faint traces of blood, a grim testament to the violence of its passage. Breathing heavily, David lowered his rifle, every muscle trembling, while Sophia gently eased Eric to the ground, ensuring he was uninjured, but visibly shaken. The three sat amidst the wreckage, bruised and exhausted, the adrenaline slowly ebbing but leaving nerves raw and senses hyper-alert. Each glance into the shadowed forest carried the unspoken understanding that the bear could return. Yet, it had chosen to retreat, leaving them alive but acutely aware of the sheer power that had just collided with their small, fragile human presence. As dawn broke, painting the river and forest in pale gold, the hunters began to assess the damage. The fire had nearly extinguished. Tents were reduced to fabric heaps, and gear was broken or lost. Yet there was no fatal injury. The raw, overwhelming force of the Kodiak bear had reminded them that on Kodiak Island, even a brief encounter could feel apocalyptic, leaving deep bruises, shattered equipment, and a profound respect for one of the planet's most formidable predators. Every step back towards safer terrain was measured, careful, their senses still alive with memory of the bear's immense power, and a silent acknowledgement passed between them that survival had depended as much on composure and quick thinking as on rifle and ammunition. By the time they reached a more secure clearing later that morning, the forest had returned to its deceptive calm. The river's rush and wind through the spruce masked the traces of violence from the night before. David, Sophia, and Eric, bruised and shaken, carried the lesson in their bodies and minds. In Kodiak, the wilderness demanded respect, and even the smallest miscalculation could unleash chaos in moments, leaving humans humbled by the raw, unstoppable force of nature. The snap of antlers against timber echoed through the narrow forest trail, a sound that made Carl's stomach tighten in a mix of fear and adrenaline as the massive bull moose exploded from the shadows, charging without warning. He had been scanning the tree line for signs of movement for hours, ears straining against the wind, the rut in full swing, and the bull already agitated by weeks of territorial disputes and the scent of females. Beside him, Jamie, his 14-year-old nephew, bounced along the rugged path on the ATV, youthful energy masking the nervous tension that Carl knew had been building all morning. Both had spent countless hours in these woods, Carl with decades of experience navigating Maine's backcountry, and Jamie with a growing curiosity for hunting. Yet nothing could fully prepare them for the sudden, terrifying weight of a bull's charge that came faster than thought and with raw, destructive power on that early October day in 2014. The trail was narrow, flanked by thick spruce and birch, snow-dusted in patches where cold nights had already left their mark, and the ATV's tires struggled for traction over hidden roots and fallen leaves. Carl's hands tightened on the handlebars as he attempted to veer left, trying to avoid a direct collision. but the bull's massive antlers clipped the front of the vehicle, sending Jamie tumbling off into a soft bed of leaves and moss with a gasp of air and a thud that made Carl's heart jump. He glimpsed his nephew rolling to his feet, limbs scrambling to regain balance, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. Instinctively, Carl leveled his rifle, bracing against the engine's vibrations, and fired into the shoulder of the moose. The shot connected with a dull thump, the animal jerking in pain but not surrendering, spinning with incredible force and slamming the ATV's rear wheel into a low tree trunk. The impact trapped supplies under the twisted frame and nearly pinned Carl beneath the machine, the vehicle groaning under pressure as his adrenaline surged. Time became distorted in those tense seconds, each heartbeat stretching as the bull pawed at the ground, hooves scraping against roots and dirt, nostrils flaring with steam in the cold morning air. Carl's mind raced, calculating angles, leverage, and escape routes while Jamie scrambled to safety, hands brushing against the rough bark of saplings, feet digging into earth and leaves. The forest seemed to close in around them, the dense pines and spruce creating a claustrophobic tunnel of green and shadow, hiding potential dangers while amplifying the roar of the bull's labored breathing and the scrape of antlers on timber. Carl's hands shook on the handlebars, revving the ATV with deliberate bursts of throttle to push the trapped rear wheel free from the tree, the engine screaming in protest while the bull pivoted, muscles coiling, ready to strike again. Each movement was measured, precise, as he used the vehicle's weight and momentum to inch backward and shove the bull's massive head away from his position. Leaves and debris flew in every direction as the moose lashed out with hooves and antlers, testing Carl's nerve and his ability to remain upright while keeping Jamie at a safe distance. The younger boy crouched behind a fallen log, breathless and frozen in anticipation, heart hammering with every shift of the bull's bulk and every grunt that rumbled like distant thunder. The interaction was a violent dance of animal instinct and human ingenuity, a test of reaction, skill, and courage under pressure. Carl swung the ATV sideways, narrowly avoiding another swipe from the bull's antlers, and fired again, this time closer, striking with accuracy that forced the animal to stagger and reconsider its aggression. It pivoted once more, hooves crashing into the earth and snow, before finally retreating into the dense pine forest, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the chaotic aftermath in its wake. Carl lowered the engine, adrenaline still spiking, and exhaled slowly as he surveyed the scene. The trail was littered with disturbed leaves, churned soil, and broken branches where the bull had tested its strength. Supplies were scattered, some crushed under the ATV's frame, others buried beneath splintered vegetation. Jamie approached cautiously, still trembling, eyes wide as he studied the scarred earth and the bruised vehicle that had served as their lifeline. Both hunters were shaken, their muscles tight with tension yet alive. Their hearts raced with a mixture of relief, respect, and lingering fear. The raw magnitude of the bull's aggression and size had been undeniable. Even when hunters were mobile, armed, and experienced, a determined moose could challenge every assumption of control. In the minutes that followed, Carl helped Jamie gather what supplies they could salvage, moving carefully across the churned earth and fallen debris, aware that a sudden sound or movement might draw the bull back if it remained nearby. Every glance into the tree line carried caution, every shadow a potential threat. Yet with each careful step, the duo began to piece together their path forward, the forest around them still humming with life, yet eerily quiet compared to the explosive charge they had just endured. They reflected on the fragility of even the best-laid plans in the wilderness, understanding that success as hunters did not equate to immunity from danger. The sun rose higher, soft morning light filtering through the pine needles and illuminating the scarred trail, casting shadows over the ATV and the flattened foliage. As Carl and Jamie cautiously remounted the ATV and resumed the trail back toward their vehicle, the forest seemed calm, almost benign. Yet both hunters carried a quiet, intense respect for the moose that had demonstrated in seconds how quickly a familiar wilderness could transform into a crucible of survival. The echo of hooves and antlers had faded, but the memory would linger indefinitely, a lesson in unpredictability and the raw, unfiltered power of the wild. It was February 12th, 2023. Ivan Petrov had just eased his snowmobile onto the narrow deer trail, the engine's hum fading into the whisper of wind through spruce and fir, when the first strike came, sudden and impossibly fast. One moment, the forest was quiet, the kind of stillness that wraps around the body like ice, and the next, a young male Siberian tiger exploded from the shadows, claws scraping metal, teeth snapping at every exposed piece of gear. Ivan's heart surged as the machine rocked violently under the force of the animal's weight, the snowmobile shuddering with each swipe, throwing snow in jagged arcs and denting the hood in ways that made his chest tighten with both fear and disbelief. He had been tracking deer along the steep slopes of the Sikodialin Mountains, a landscape of jagged ridges, dense spruce stands, and deep snowdrifts that made each footstep an exertion of balance and strength. The morning had begun with measured caution. Ivan, a man in his early 40s with years of Siberian backcountry experience etched into his weathered features, had checked the snow depth, observed deer tracks, and plotted a careful path for the snowmobile to follow without risking hidden ice or steep drop-offs. His rifle, a well-worn .30-06, lay across his lap, safety off, rounds ready. Yet, nothing could have prepared him for the lightning-quick emergence of the tiger, a predator weighing over 200 pounds, muscles coiled beneath orange and black fur, eyes glowing with curiosity and instinctive aggression. The tiger's first swipe shredded the hood, claws raking deep furrows into metal and scraping across frozen snow. Ivan fired a single round, bullets thudding into the flank, and for a fraction of a second, the animal recoiled only to pivot with frightening speed, leaping onto the side of the snowmobile, claws slashing across Ivan's forearms as he tried to steady himself and keep balance. The snowmobile rocked on uneven ground, skis sliding on icy patches, and Ivan's boots scrabbled for grip, pressing against snow and frozen moss to prevent a fall. Every movement was calculated, each second elongated as the tiger struck repeatedly, teeth snapping at gear and supplies, its massive paws slamming against metal and plastic alike, testing Ivan's nerve and strength simultaneously. Supplies, food, water, extra ammunition scattered as the tiger's claws shredded the seat and backpack, sending items tumbling into snowdrifts. Ivan jammed rounds into the rifle with trembling hands, the .306 heavy but necessary in every tense instant, his breath coming in sharp gasps as adrenaline surged through every fiber of his body. The tiger's strikes were precise, terrifyingly calculated. Each swipe meant to probe, dominate, and assess vulnerability. Yet it was clear the animal was not seeking a kill, at least not in this encounter. It was territory, strength, and instinct, a warning delivered through muscle, claw, and fang. Ivan fired again, grazing the tiger's flank, a spray of snow and tufts of fur marking impact points, and the animal recoiled just enough to circle warily, teeth bared, claws still extended. The snowmobile rocked precariously, and Ivan adjusted his weight, his boots digging into the snow while he kept the rifle aligned with the predator's movements. For 30 tense seconds, the confrontation escalated and receded in waves. Predator and hunter engaged in a silent, primal contest of dominance and endurance. Each strike of the tiger's paw or teeth was met with careful calculation, and every round fired a desperate effort to maintain control while balancing on the wobbling machine. Finally, the tiger paused, sniffing the air, head tilting as though weighing options, muscles tense but still. It backed off, circling slowly, eyes never leaving Ivan, before disappearing silently into the spruce, paws soft on snow, leaving a scarred landscape behind. The snowmobile was dented, gear shredded, and supplies scattered across a half-frozen trail, yet Ivan remained upright, heart hammering, muscles trembling, his arms cut and bruised where claws had raked but not broken skin deeply. The forest returned to silence almost immediately, the echoes of the encounter lingering only in Ivan's rapid breathing and the ringing of adrenaline that refused to fade. As he sat for a long moment, gripping the snowmobile's handlebars, Ivan absorbed the full weight of what had just occurred. The tiger had tested him, assessed his reactions, and demonstrated in brutal, fast-moving sequences how even non-lethal wildlife encounters could be devastatingly aggressive and dangerous. His rifle lay ready across his lap, but the tension had shifted from firing at a target to surviving a living force that seemed to move in 3 dimensions simultaneously, weighing every decision and strike against the hunter's response. Even when no life-threatening injury occurred, the encounter left bruises, shredded supplies, and a sense of vulnerability that lingered far longer than the tiger's presence itself. The aftermath was quiet but intense. The snowmobile, dented and scratched, seemed almost fragile under the enormity of the tiger's strikes, and Ivan carefully righted scattered gear, salvaging what he could while keeping an eye on the surrounding forest, alert for any return movement. His arms throbbed with pain, and his mind raced through every instant, recalling paw strikes, teeth snaps, and the sheer force of impact that had tossed him sideways and tested balance and coordination like a brutal examination. Survival had depended as much on instinct and composure as on weaponry, and the encounter left him acutely aware that the wilderness in this remote region of Russia allowed little margin for error. By the time Ivan finally began to move the snowmobile along the trail, the forest was calm, shadows lengthening over snow-laden branches, yet he carried the weight of the event in every nerve and muscle. The tiger had vanished, but the lesson remained vivid, an indelible demonstration of raw strength, intelligence, and the unpredictable aggression that Siberian tigers could exhibit when humans entered their territory. Each careful step forward reinforced the understanding that encounters with apex predators, even non-lethal ones, were tests of respect, observation, and rapid decision-making, a reminder that in the wilderness, control was always tenuous and even brief. Terrifying moments could leave a permanent mark.